This is a sealed record. I want that stated clearly at the outset, before I say anything else. What I am about to describe was logged aboard UNES Ardent Theorem on the 14th of March, Year 7 of the Outer Survey Mandate, classified at Source Level 3 within 6 hours of the event, and subsequently elevated to Source Level 5 by Admiral Command Outer Reach on the following morning. It remained at that level for 3 years. I am giving this testimony now because the Naval Board's reclassification review has determined that the event record should enter the Permanent Survey Archive, and because I am the only living officer present for all 60 minutes of what took place at the Solvani Threshold on that day. I have been asked to speak plainly. I intend to. My name is Lena Verk. I held the rank of captain in the United Earth Naval Survey Corps at the time of the event. I commanded the UNES Ardent Theorem, a diplomatic survey cruiser of the Crest class, hull number DSC 1147, assigned to the Outer Reach Survey Mandate under Standing Order 14G. That order authorized survey vessels to approach and document the border designations of recognized galactic powers within non-contested space, provided those vessels carried full diplomatic registry, made no aggressive approach, and transmitted their mandate codes on standard hail frequencies no fewer than 48 hours prior to any threshold crossing. We had transmitted our mandate codes, on time in full, on all required frequencies with all required attachments, at 48 hours and again at 24 hours and again at 6. Protocol, standing order. We did not deviate from any element of it, and I want that on record because I have encountered accounts of the event that suggest we improvised our way through it, or that our conduct was a matter of instinct or accident or improvised bravery. It was not. We followed procedure at every point where procedure existed, and where it did not exist, where we were in territory the procedure writers had not anticipated. We used judgment, and I will describe the judgments we made and why we made them. I want to be precise about the sequence of events because the specific texture of what happened is, in my view, the entire point. So I am going to describe what happened as it happened, in the order it happened, including what my people did and what they did not do, because both things are part of the record, and the things they did not do are as important as the things they did. The Ardent Theorem had been on station at the Outer Reach for 11 months by the time we reached the Solvani Threshold. We were not the first survey vessel to plot the Solvani border. The DSC 1041 Ardent Register had done that work 14 years prior, but we were the first to receive formal survey authorization to approach within the diplomatic contact radius of the Solvani Reach, which is defined in the Outer Survey Mandate as a distance of no less than 30,000 kilometers from any Solvani-registered stellar installation. The authorization had not come easily. The Outer Survey Mandate Review Committee had deliberated for 11 months before issuing it, and the approval carried 4 additional conditions not present in the standard Standing Order 14G template. 2. Required additional sensor and communications logging protocols, which we implemented fully, including redundant recording systems and simultaneous transmission to Naval Command Outer Reach. 1. Required that I maintain a real-time event log throughout any contact event, which we implemented with 4 independent data pathways in case of signal interruption. The 4th required that I retain discretionary authority to abort the approach at any point, and that I certify, in writing, that I understood this authority was expected to be used if circumstances warranted it. I wrote that certification. I understood the authority. I understood that the committee had added that condition because they were uncertain about what we would find, and because giving a field commander an explicit abort authorization is the institutional way of leaving a light on for someone who might need to find their way back in the dark. I appreciated the intent. I did not use it. Whether I should have is a question I have been asked before, and my answer has not changed in 6 years. No. I should not have. I will explain why not. But first I need to explain what we were approaching, because without that context, the decision is impossible to evaluate fairly. The Solvani Dominion is old. I want to be precise about this, because the word gets used loosely, and in this context it carries specific weight. When I say old, I do not mean old in the way a senior fleet admiral is old, or old in the way Earth's oceans are old. I mean old in the way that makes the entire span of recorded human civilization feel like a brief chapter in a very long book, and not a chapter near the beginning. Our Xenological Survey database, at the time of the event, carried 11,400 years of Solvani contact records from sources outside the Dominion itself. Third-party records kept by the Cathori sovereignty, the Vahari reckoning, and 4 other civilizations we had made prior contact with during the Outer Reach Mandate. 11,400 years of recorded external contact, and those records almost certainly do not represent the beginning. They represent the point at which external civilizations became sophisticated enough to write things down in ways that survived long enough to reach us. The Solvani's own history, as best we could infer from what others had written about them, was considerably older than the oldest record in our database. In 11,400 years of contact records, the Solvani Dominion had reclassified exactly 3 species as restricted origin. I did not know this when we arrived at the threshold. I learned it 6 days afterward, when the Xenological Archive team that had been tracking our survey progress flagged it in an urgent dispatch. They wanted to know what we had done. I told them I would need to think carefully about how to answer that question. What I knew when we arrived was what was in our survey database. The Solvani Dominion was a caste-based hierarchical civilization, occupying an estimated volume of 14 star systems, with acknowledged client states or treaty-bound proxies in a further 6. They did not communicate with non-Dominion civilizations through what we would recognize as diplomatic channels. They used a system of contact classification, a formal protocol, 11,000 years old in its documented form, through which new civilizations were assessed by the Solvani contact fleet and assigned to one of 7 categories. Category 1 was recognized peer civilization, full diplomatic exchange authorized. Category 7 was restricted contact under a non-engagement protocol with borders sealed pending future review. Our database contained records of the Solvani assigning category designations to 46 civilizations over their documented contact history. I had read every one of those records, some of them many times, during our 11 months at the Outer Reach. Most were fragments, captured in the archives of civilizations that had witnessed the contact events from outside and kept records of what they observed. The records were consistent in certain respects. The contact fleet always deployed in the same formation, the assessment always produced a designation, and the designation was always communicated, sometimes directly to the assessed civilization, sometimes only to the Solvani internal registry, within the hour of the assessment's conclusion. The lowest category ever assigned to a surviving civilization was 4. A Category 4 designation, according to the Cathori archive, indicated a civilization the Solvani had assessed as developing but not yet peer-capable, and it came with a protocol of limited observation contact, no exchange, reassessment authorized on request after a minimum interval of 50 years. The civilization that held Category 4 was, based on our most recent third-party information, thriving. They had been reassessed twice. They had moved to Category 3 on their second assessment. The Solvani system, it seemed, was capable of updating its conclusions. 3 civilizations had been designated restricted origin, which sat entirely outside the 7-category system. The database could not fully explain the designation because the Solvani had never communicated it to any external party directly. We knew it existed because the 3 civilizations that received it had recorded receiving it before contact between them and the Solvani ended entirely. The records were sparse. Each civilization had captured a fragment of the departure broadcast, enough to identify the format and the designation code, not enough to understand the reasoning. Two of those civilizations were still active. Both appeared, based on third-party records, to be thriving. Neither had received any subsequent Solvani contact, as far as external observers could determine. The third civilization, the one that was no longer active, had not been destroyed by the Solvani. It had, according to the most reliable third-party record we held, dissolved internally over a period of approximately 3 centuries following the designation, for reasons that were unrelated in any documented way to the Solvani contact event. I had read that record carefully because I wanted to be certain of what it said before I briefed my senior staff, and what it said was that the designation appeared to be a category, not a sentence. I had read those 3 records on 3 separate occasions during our 11 months at the outer reach. I read them again on the night before we crossed the contact radius. I did not learn anything new on that reading. I simply wanted the shape of them in my mind, not the facts, which I had memorized, but the texture of what had happened to those 3 civilizations when they were encountered by a system 11,000 years old, and found to be something that system could not file in the ordinary way. I briefed my senior staff on all of this 2 days before we reached the threshold. I kept the briefing factual and uninterpretive. I showed them the 46 contact records and the 7-category system and the 3 restricted origin cases. I showed them what we knew and acknowledged clearly what we did not know. I told them the assessment protocol as best we could characterize it from external records, and I told them that based on all available precedent, the contact fleet would not communicate until the assessment was complete, and that the assessment period had no documented duration. We knew only the outcomes, not how long the process of arriving at them typically took. My executive officer, Commander Harlan Cest, asked whether the 3 restricted origin civilizations were still active. I told him 2 were, and that both appeared to be thriving. He asked if the Solvani had ever explained the designation to any external party. I told him the records did not indicate that they had. He said that was interesting, in a tone that conveyed he meant it as a precise observation rather than an emotional response, and went back to his pre-approach checklist. My sensor chief, Mara Dolan, asked whether the contact fleet had ever deployed the formation against a vessel that subsequently departed the contact radius before the assessment was complete. I told her I had not found a case of that in the records. She nodded and returned to her instruments. My communications officer, Lieutenant Sola Merrick, asked whether our database records of the Solvani contact band frequencies were current enough to be reliable. I told her the most recent confirmation we had was 8 years old, from the Kethori archive, which had verified the same frequencies they had been documenting for centuries. I said I had no reason to believe they had changed, but that she should monitor adjacent bands as well, as a precaution. She said she intended to. She covered 6 bands during the event and logged every moment of what was on each of them. My tactical officer, Lieutenant Jord Cavell, asked whether the geometric array had ever been observed to change configuration after its initial assembly, to compress, or expand, or shift its geometry in response to what was being assessed. I told him the records contained no instance of that. He said he would monitor for it anyway, and track any positional deviations in real time. I told him that was exactly right. Nobody asked me whether we should turn around. I want to be very clear about this. Nobody asked whether we should abort the approach. Nobody referenced the 4th condition on our authorization. Nobody suggested, in that briefing or in the 11 days between that briefing and the event itself, that what we were doing was beyond the scope of what we should do. My senior staff received the complete picture, asked the questions they needed to ask to understand it, and prepared to do their jobs. That is the kind of crew they were, and I want it in the record, because the crew is as much a part of the event as anything else I have described. We crossed the formal boundary of the Solvani diplomatic contact radius at 6:11 hours ship time on the 14th of March. The Ardent Theorem was running at 1/3 survey speed, all external lights on standard navigation configuration, all weapon systems locked in stand-down protocol, per Standing Order 14G. We were transmitting our mandate codes on 4 frequencies simultaneously. We received no acknowledgement. This was not unexpected. Our database indicated the Solvani protocol involved no advance acknowledgement. The system was designed to assess first, respond after. We had built this into our expectation framework and our planning. We would hold course, transmit our codes, and wait. At 6:43 hours, our deep sensor array registered the first Solvani signature. I was at the command station when Sensor Chief Dolan called it. She said, "Captain, I have a contact. Single hull, configuration unknown, bearing 274, range approximately 400,000 kilometers." A pause. Correction, 2 contacts. Same bearing, range spreading slightly, they were traveling in close formation. Another pause, 3 contacts. I told her to continue calling it. She did. By 6:57 hours she had called 15 contacts. By 7:04, 31. By 7:11, 47. They came out of what our sensors characterized as null transit space, a transit method detectable only at the moment of emergence, not during approach. Reading about it in a database entry and watching 47 hull signatures appear on your sensor display in the space of 30 minutes are 2 very different kinds of knowing, and I want to be honest about the gap between them. I had read the database records carefully. I had briefed my crew on what to expect. None of that was the same as the moment when the first contact designation appeared on my display, and I understood, in my body rather than in my mind, that the situation I had prepared for was now the situation I was in. My sensor chief called contacts at roughly 2 per minute through the middle of that window. Her voice was level. Her pronunciation of each contact identifier was clean and precise, as if she were reading from a prepared list rather than watching the geometry of our situation change around her in real time, entry by entry. I watched her hands. They did not shake. I do not say this to suggest she was not afraid. I have no idea whether she was afraid in that specific moment. I was afraid. Fear is a reasonable response to 47 unknown vessels emerging around your single-hull diplomatic cruiser in the space of 30 minutes, and I consider anyone who claims otherwise to be either lying or deficient in the kind of imagination that makes for a useful officer. What I mean is that her hands were steady because she was doing her job, and her job required steady hands and a clear voice, and so she had them. The fear and the work existed simultaneously in her, and the work won, which is exactly what professional conduct looks like when the stakes are high enough to make professional conduct difficult. The 47 Solvani vessels arranged themselves in a formation called, in the Cathori contact records, the geometric array. 47 hulls in a precise 3-dimensional pattern, roughly spherical in overall geometry, at equal radial distances from the central point. When my tactical officer mapped it on our display, the central point was the Ardent Theorem. We were inside the sphere. The closest Solvani vessel was approximately 12,000 kilometers off our port bow. The farthest was approximately 160,000 kilometers off our stern. All 47 were equidistant from us in the angular sense. Draw a line from any one of them to the center of the formation, and you traveled the same angular distance. A perfect geometric shell, assembled from a cold null-space emergence. My tactical officer, when he finished mapping it, put his stylus down on the console with great deliberateness and said, in a voice meant only for me, "They came out in position. They didn't adjust. They came out in position." I confirmed that our sensors supported that interpretation. He said, "How long have they been practicing this?" I told him 11,000 years, at minimum. He nodded once and went back to his tracking work. He did not say anything else about it. I hailed the Solvani formation at 7:13 hours, once the formation had completed and all 47 vessels had gone to holding position. I transmitted our full mandate code package, our diplomatic registry, our standing order authorization, and a plain language statement identifying the Ardent Theorem, her commanding officer, her mission parameters, and her intent. Survey documentation under non-hostile approach protocol, no territorial claim, full transparency of purpose, request for acknowledgement and guidance on contact protocol. The formation did not respond. I hailed again at 7:30, at 7:45, at 800. Each time I transmitted the same package plus an updated statement acknowledging that we had received no response and were holding position pending their acknowledgement. Each time the formation held position in perfect silence. Their weapon systems were in an active configuration, not a targeting configuration, as best we could determine, but powered and available. The transition time from active to targeting was shorter than my response time. I knew this. I had known it since 7/11 when the last hull reached its position. I did not issue a defensive order. Standing Order 14G authorizes a survey vessel commander to stand down diplomatic protocol and transition to defensive posture if that commander judges the vessel faces imminent hostile action. In 11,400 years of Solvani contact records, the contact fleet had never fired on a vessel that had not first either crossed the inner Solvani border without authorization or directly targeted a Solvani vessel. We had done neither. We were inside the diplomatic contact radius, which is explicitly not the inner border. We had not targeted anyone. Their weapons being active was not evidence of imminent action. It was evidence of readiness, which is different, and the distinction matters. I judged hostile action was not imminent. I judged that what was happening was assessment, and that the active weapons configuration was part of the assessment posture, not a preparation to fire but an element of how the Solvani system presented itself during evaluation. Visible capability, not aimed capability. And I made a second judgment, which I consider more important, that transitioning to defensive posture in the middle of an assessment by a civilization 11,000 years old would constitute a specific kind of answer to a question they had not yet finished asking. It would tell them something about what we did when we were afraid and uncertain, and what we did when we were afraid and uncertain was reach for our weapons, and I did not want to tell them that. What I wanted to tell them, what we had been telling them since 6/11, was that we had come here with a mandate and we were holding it. I hailed at 8:15, nothing. I hailed at 8:30, nothing. I hailed at 8:45, nothing. At some point in the interval between 8:45 and 900, I decided not to hail again. We had transmitted our codes, our registry, our mandate, our intent, our request for guidance, 4 times each. We had given them everything we had. Continuing to transmit was not going to add to the picture. It was going to add to the picture only one thing, which was evidence that I was uncomfortable with silence, and I was not going to give them that. So I sat in my command chair, and I watched the sensor display, and I waited. The bridge of the Ardent Theorem during those 60 minutes is something I want to describe carefully, because I think it is part of the record in a way that sensor logs cannot capture. The Ardent Theorem carried a complement of 112. The bridge at full rotation carried 17 officers and crew plus myself. During the assessment, I had a full rotation on station, not because I had ordered it, but because the off-rotation had declined to rotate off. They had come to their stations at the 600 change of watch, learned what was forming on the sensors at 6:43 and stayed. The on-duty rotation stayed too. I had 34 people on a bridge designed for 18, and nobody said anything about it, and nobody asked for permission to be there, and nobody asked to leave. I noticed the doubled crew at around the 40-minute mark, when I turned from the sensor display and saw the second ring of officers standing behind the primary stations. Every one of them was at their secondary console or in ready position behind a primary operator. Nobody was talking. Nobody was standing at the back of the bridge watching the main display out of curiosity or anxiety. They were all doing something, monitoring, recording, maintaining a second layer of readiness at a station that already had someone assigned to it, providing redundancy and depth to work that was already being done competently. I considered saying something about it. Then I decided not to. We had the space. Emergency movement would have been possible. And the truth is, and I want this in the record, their presence steadied me. Not because it changed our tactical position, which it did not, or because more eyes on the instruments changed what the instruments were reading, which they did not. It steadied me because of what it said about how those people had decided to spend those 60 minutes. They could have been in the mess, or in their quarters, or standing in the corridors listening to the ambient hum of the ship and waiting for something to change. Instead, they were at their stations, doing their work, adding their precision to a situation that was already being handled by the people it was assigned to. That decision, quiet, unremarkable, made individually by 34 off-rotation crew without any instruction from me, is, I think, as accurate a characterization of the Ardent Theorem as anything else I could offer this board. I want to say something more about what it was like to be in that room during those minutes, because I have tried before to describe it, and I have never felt that I got it quite right. The sensor display in front of me showed 47 contacts, each one a color-coded positional marker at its designated coordinate, each one holding steady. The tactical overlay showed the geometric array mapped in 3 dimensions, a perfect spherical shell around us, rendered in the pale blue of the tactical system's default, with the Ardent Theorem at the center rendered in a slightly different shade to indicate our own position. If you looked at that display without knowing what it represented, it looked like a diagram in a textbook. It looked mathematical, clean. What it was 47 armed vessels belonging to a civilization 11,000 years old, arranged around us with a precision we could not match, running some form of assessment that we could not observe in real time, deciding something about us that we could not predict, in a silence so complete our instruments could not fully account for it. That was what the clean blue diagram was. I thought about this during the assessment. I thought about the gap between the representation and the reality, and about how the gap could become dangerous if I allowed myself to forget it. The display could make this look abstract. It was not abstract. The closest hull was 12,000 kilometers. At standard engagement velocity for a vessel in that class, which we could not determine precisely but could bracket from the contact geometry and their demonstrated transit capability, 12,000 kilometers was a matter of minutes. Less, perhaps. I did not know their weapons range. I did not know their targeting cycle time. I knew that they had chosen, so far, not to act on any of it, and that the database gave me good reasons to believe they would not act without provocation. I held those reasons carefully. I did not pretend the diagram was the situation. What I noticed, in my own reaction during those 60 minutes, was something I have not often felt in 30 years of naval service, which is a very precise and narrow form of calm that is distinct from the absence of fear. It is not the calm of someone who has concluded that everything will be all right. It is the calm of someone who has concluded that everything will go exactly as it goes, and that the only variable they control is how they perform their own function while it goes, and that there is therefore only one thing worth spending attention on. I felt that calm settle into me at roughly the 20-minute mark after I had decided not to issue a defensive order, and it stayed with me through the remaining 40 minutes. My hands were in my lap. My back was straight. My eyes were on the display. My crew saw that. I know they saw it because I have thought about it since, and I believe it mattered. A crew watches its commanding officer during the hard minutes in the same way that a body watches its own heartbeat, not consciously but continuously, as a baseline against which to calibrate its own response. I was the baseline. I was sitting in my chair, hands in my lap, watching the display. Whatever that said to them about whether to be afraid, I think it said it clearly enough. The bridge was quiet. Not the suppressed quiet of people trying to be quiet. That has a specific texture, the quality of held breath and minimized movement, recognizable to any officer with enough bridge time. This was different. The working quiet of people doing their jobs at full capacity, which happens to be, when the job is watching and measuring and recording, a naturally silent activity. My sensor chief was updating her contact log in real time, noting the positional data for all 47 hulls on a 15-second interval. My navigation officer, Lieutenant Prelvasu, was maintaining our holding position to within 10 meters of the designated point. I verified this afterward in the position record, and the figure is accurate, 10 meters, for 60 minutes, against the microdrift currents of the local space environment. That is exceptional work under any conditions, and it is remarkable work under the specific condition of knowing that 47 armed vessels are equidistant from you in a perfect sphere at distances ranging from 12 to 160,000 kilometers. You know that. You feel it in the way that knowledge of things that are dangerous and close is felt, and your navigation hold stays at 10 meters regardless. My communications officer was monitoring 6 frequencies simultaneously, and logging the absence of signal on the same reporting schedule she would have used to log active signal. My tactical officer was tracking all 47 hull positions for any deviation from their established coordinates. There were no deviations. Cable ran the positional data afterward and found that the average deviation of any single Solvani vessel from its established location across the full 60-minute assessment period was 30 meters, at distances ranging from 12,000 to 160,000 kilometers from the formation center. He showed me that number at about the 45-minute mark during the assessment itself, having calculated it in real time as data accumulated through his tracking system. He said, without inflection and without looking up from his display, "I don't know if we can do that." I told him to keep tracking. He said, "Yes, Captain," and went back to it. At the 38-minute mark, Lieutenant Merrick came to stand just to my left. She said she was not entirely certain her receivers were functional, and she wanted me to know why she thought so. She had been monitoring the Solvani bands for 38 minutes and had received nothing she could characterize as a transmission of any kind. Not signal, not background noise. Not the ambient electromagnetic signature she would expect from 47 large vessels with active weapons, arrays at distances as close as 12,000 kilometers. She said the silence on their bands read to her as active suppression rather than natural absence. Something was being done to produce that silence, not merely the absence of something, and she wanted to confirm that her instructions were to continue monitoring it. I told her to continue. I told her the silence was data, and that we should keep measuring it as carefully as we would measure any other kind of signal. She returned to her station. I thought about active suppression for a while. 47 vessels, weapons powered, formation precise to 30 meters, and not a whisper on any of 6 monitored frequencies. They were not simply not talking to us. They were in a communication silence so complete that it exceeded what their physical presence should have produced, which meant they had the capability to remove themselves from the electromagnetic environment in a deliberate and controlled way. That was a capability statement. It said something about what kind of civilization this was, and what level of technological sophistication and discipline they had brought to an encounter they presumably considered routine. At the 53rd minute, Commander Cest came to stand beside me one final time before it ended. He said he had been thinking about the 3 restricted origin civilizations in the database, and he wanted to know whether I thought the designation was punitive in intent. I considered the question carefully before I answered. I said I did not think it was punitive. I thought it was categorical. The Solvani system had a place for certain things, and what mattered was not the moral weight of that place, but the criterion that triggered assignment to it. He said, "What criterion do you think triggers it?" I said I did not know. I said I had been thinking about it for 6 weeks and I still did not know. He said, "What do you think we look like to them right now?" I thought about it. What did we look like? A single diplomatic survey cruiser, Crest class, 112 souls, weapons locked down, transmitting codes, holding position in the exact center of a 47-vessel assessment formation belonging to a civilization 11,000 years old. Not retreating, not powering weapons, not maneuvering, not escalating our hail frequency in visible desperation, simply holding, simply waiting. I said, "I think we look like something they haven't seen before." He said, "I was thinking the same thing." A pause. "Is that good or bad?" I said that was the question they were trying to answer. He nodded once and went back to his station. At 9:11 hours, Sensor Chief Dolan said, "Captain, movement. All contacts simultaneous. Vector is away from the formation center." I said, "Rate." She said, "Steady. No acceleration spike." They went from holding to transit speed in a single step. Transit signatures forming on all 47. Simultaneous. I said, "Record everything." She said, "Recording." I said, "Lieutenant Merrick, any transmission?" Merrick said, "Checking." The pause was 11 seconds by the log, though it felt longer. "Yes, Captain. Single burst. Broadband, not directional broadcast across the contact radius, not targeted at us specifically. Duration approximately 4 seconds. Format unknown. No match in our database." I said, "Record it in full and keep the frequency open." She said, "Recording. Frequency is open." At 9:13 hours, Dolan confirmed the all-clear sweep. 47 contacts departed simultaneously. No residual signatures, no debris, no indication of any Solvani presence within maximum sensor range. The geometric array was gone. I sat in my command chair for approximately 1 minute after the all-clear. The bridge was still quiet, a different kind of quiet now, the breathing out quiet of people processing what had just ended. I heard someone exhale slowly behind my left shoulder. I heard the navigation officer make a small correction to our holding position, though we were no longer required to hold it. Muscle memory. The continuation of a task that had been real for 60 minutes and was now formally complete. I said, "Stand down from full alert. Maintain current holding position. Commander Cest, please take the bridge. I will be in my briefing room." Cest said, "Aye, Captain." I went to my briefing room and I sat down, and I spent 20 minutes writing the event record. Not because my memory required time to organize itself, it was organized, but because I wanted the language exact before I transmitted it up the chain. Imprecision in event records becomes imprecision in the responses to them, and the responses to this one would matter. The event record is part of the survey archive, and the Naval Board has reviewed it, so I will not reproduce it here. The essential sequence I have described matches what appears in that record. I then spent 2 additional hours on the transmission analysis. The Solvani broadcast was 4 seconds long and carried no format recognizable to our communication systems. It was not in any language in our database. It was not a mathematical signal of the type that first contact doctrine identifies as a universal opener. It was not in any encoding standard we held records of the Solvani using across 46 prior documented contacts. Merrick had run it against every comparison set we carried within the first 20 minutes of my arriving in the communications bay. The result was consistent. Unknown format, no match. What we could characterize was the signal's internal structure. It was not random. Our signal analysis routines identified a repetition interval, a consistent internal ratio, a sequencing that Cavell, after 3 hours working with the raw file, described as organized around a principle we could identify but could not yet decode. He showed me the analysis element by element. The signal had internal logic. It was built with intent. It was saying something specific, in a language we did not have, using a format we had not encountered before. We simply did not have the vocabulary. I kept Cavell on the signal. He remained on it for 4 days before I needed him for the archive dispatch response. Then he returned to it. He made progress over that time, not toward translation, but toward structural characterization. The architecture of the signal became clearer to him. By the end of those 4 days, his working hypothesis, which he stated explicitly and carefully as a hypothesis and not a finding, was that the signal contained a designation. A single piece of information, broadcast at the moment of departure across the contact radius as its medium, so that any Solvani receiver within range could capture the same filing simultaneously. I asked what kind of designation. He said the signal's structural elements were consistent with what he had been able to reconstruct of Solvani internal registry transmission format, based on third-party records in our database that described how the Dominion communicated contact outcomes to its own systems. He said it was possible that what we had received was a classification record, a formal filing, transmitted on departure, using the contact radius itself as the broadcast space. I asked what the designation said. He said he could not read it. He could characterize the signal as a filing. He could identify the structural position of the designation within the filing format. He could not read the designation itself. I told him to keep working. He kept working. He has been working it for 6 years, with a team that has grown from himself and a junior analyst to 11 people with access to the archive resources of 3 xenological institutions. I mention this not to catalog the analytical effort, but because the scale of attention the signal has attracted, from people who work in this field and understand what they are looking at, is itself a piece of information about what the signal is. Cavell's team has made significant progress. Some of that progress is part of the classified record this board has access to. I will not characterize it beyond what is in that record. What I will say is that Cavell told me in private conversation approximately 8 months ago that he believes he is close. He believes he will be able to read the designation within the next 2 years. He is a careful man who chooses his language deliberately, and he said close, not confident, and 2 years, not soon. I take that estimate at full weight. I want to describe the 6 days between the departure and the xenological archive dispatch, because those days are part of my testimony in a way the sensor records alone cannot capture. The 6 days after the Solvani fleet left were the quietest of my 11 months aboard the Ardent Theorem. Not quiet in the sense that routine operations ceased, but quiet in the specific way that a crew becomes when it is collectively processing something large and has not yet reached a conclusion and understands without being told that the conclusion will take the time it takes. Nobody was alarmed. Nobody was agitated. Nobody sought me out to express anxiety or demand answers I did not have. They were thinking, the way good survey officers think when they encounter things that do not resolve quickly, steadily, without pressure, with the patience that is a different kind of discipline from the discipline of holding a formation position. I was thinking too. I spent those 6 days thinking more carefully than I had thought about anything in some years, and I want to describe what I was thinking about, because it is directly relevant to the testimony I am giving now. I was thinking about the Solvani system, not tactically. That analysis was complete and the record reflected it. I was thinking about what it was at its root. 11,000 years old, 49 contact events, a 7-category classification framework that had successfully accommodated 46 new civilizations and failed to accommodate 3. A departure broadcast protocol that filed a designation at the moment of leaving, so that the filing was simultaneous with the departure, so that the assessment and its outcome were one action rather than 2. I was thinking about what it means to build a system for categorizing things you have never seen before. It is inherently a problem of projection. You build the categories based on what you have seen, and then you use those categories to interpret what you see next. The categories are never neutral. They encode assumptions about the range of variation in whatever you are categorizing, assumptions about which dimensions of variation matter, assumptions about what the extreme cases look like. A category system built by a civilization that has been assessing others for 11,000 years encodes 11,000 years of assumptions. It is, in a meaningful sense, a theory of what other civilizations are like. And what I kept coming back to, in those 6 days, was the question of what that theory had assumed about us before the assessment began. Not us specifically. The Solvani had no more information about humanity than what they could obtain from our approach trajectory, our hull profile, our emission signature, and the content of our mandate transmissions. I mean, what category did their theory assume we would end up in? Not which specific number, but what kind of civilization, with what kind of range of responses, producing what kind of assessment outcome. They had 48 data points. They had a framework that had worked for 48 data points. They approached 49 with the same framework. And something about 49 didn't fit. I thought about that for 6 days. I thought about what kind of thing doesn't fit an 11,000-year-old classification system for civilizations. Not the obvious things, not size or capability or technological level, because those were continuous variables the system had presumably been calibrated against across many different examples. What doesn't fit is something that changes the nature of what is being measured, rather than just the magnitude. I came back, again and again, to the same place. The Solvani system was measuring responses, the specific behavioral responses of new civilizations when presented with the geometric array. What does a civilization do when 47 armed vessels appear around its single ship and spend an hour watching it? What does it reach for? What does it say? In what way does its reaction reveal what kind of thing it is? The system had, presumably, encoded 48 answers to those questions. It had used those answers to build and refine a theory of what new civilizations do. And then it had encountered one that did not produce a recognizable answer, not a threatening answer, not a submissive answer, not a diplomatic answer, not a panicked answer. Something it did not have a category for. Something that simply waited. I have thought about this for 6 years, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. That patience, in a specific and unusual form, is what we gave them that they had not seen before. Not patience as endurance, the ability to outlast a bad situation. Patience as methodology, the deliberate, informed, disciplined withholding of response until response becomes appropriate. The kind of patience that is also a form of analysis. We are watching, we are recording, we are thinking, and when we have something worth saying, we will say it, and until then we will hold. I do not know if any of the 48 prior civilizations in the Solvani contact record gave them that. I know we did. On the 3rd day, Navigation Officer Vasu came to my briefing room and asked, with a formality that told me he had been composing the question carefully, whether I thought we would be sent back. I told him the decision would be made above my level, but that my recommendation would depend on the signal analysis and the archive review. He said he understood. Then he said he would like to go back, if and when it was authorized, and that he wanted me to know that. I told him I would note it. On the 4th day, Marek told me she had been monitoring the Solvani bands continuously since the departure, and that the silence had not changed. Whatever active suppression had produced it during the assessment was still in place, or there was simply nothing there to receive. Her equipment could not distinguish between those two possibilities with sufficient precision to choose one, and she wanted me to know that the silence continued as a data state, not as an absence of data. On the fifth day, Sensor Chief Dolan handed me a report she had written on her own initiative. It summarized the positional data from all 47 hulls across the full 60-minute assessment period, with complete statistical analysis, average positional deviation, maximum deviation across all hulls, time series of any drift corrections made by individual vessels. She had added a comparison section using the positioning specifications of our own naval fleet's standard formation holding protocols under comparable environmental conditions. The comparison showed that the Solvani had held their formation to a standard approximately 40 times more precise than our best current capability. She had included this comparison without editorial comment. She handed me the report and said nothing else about it. I read it twice and filed it with the event archive. I thought about it for a long time afterward. 40 times more precise. 11,000 years of practice expressed in a number. On the sixth day, the Xenological Archive dispatch arrived from Dr. Ilan Sorvith, head of the Outer Reach Xenological Contact Archive. It was 3 paragraphs. The first summarized the event record as we had transmitted it. The second flagged the restricted origin precedent, 3 designations in 11,400 years of documented contact, and we had received a departure transmission of unknown format. The third paragraph asked, in the careful and precisely chosen language that characterized all of Sorvith's communications, whether we had received any indication of how the Ardent Theorem had been classified. I composed my reply over 2 hours. I told Sorvith we had received a transmission of unknown format at the moment of departure, that our analysis officer's working hypothesis was that it constituted a classification filing, and that we had been unable to determine the content of that filing. I said I would include the full signal file with the event archive, and that the xenological team was welcome to work it with whatever resources they could apply. I did not include Cavel's structural characterization notes in that first exchange. I wanted to see what Sorvith's team produced independently before comparing. I did not share Cavel's hypothesis with the Naval Board in my initial report, either. I told the board we had received a transmission of unknown format and that analysis was ongoing. I made this decision deliberately, and I would make it again. I have spent a career watching preliminary hypotheses travel up command chains, and I know what happens to them on the way. A hypothesis becomes a finding becomes a fact becomes a policy, and a policy gets built on a foundation that was always meant to be provisional. I was not going to let that process run on Cavel's 3-day-old characterization, carefully labeled as it was. The Naval Board accepted my recommendation to postpone any further approach to the Solvani Threshold for no less than 18 months. They requested monthly signal analysis updates. I filed them for 9 months. Cavel's structural characterization became more confident over that period. He was more certain the signal was a filing. He had identified what he believed was the structural position of the designation within the filing format. He could bracket it, as he described it, even if he could not yet read it. At the 9-month mark, Sorvith's second dispatch arrived. His team had been working the signal independently and had a finding, not a hypothesis, a finding. They had cross-referenced the Ardent Theorem departure broadcast against the archive records from the 3 restricted origin cases. 2 of those cases had partial departure broadcast records, captured by third-party receivers at range, imperfectly preserved across the intervening centuries, but present. Sorvith's team had run those 2 partial records against the Ardent Theorem broadcast using 3 independent analysis methodologies, and stated their confidence level with the precision I had come to expect from him. What the dispatch said, in its final paragraph, the structural match between the Ardent Theorem departure broadcast and the 2 restricted origin precedent broadcasts was sufficient to support a working hypothesis of designation equivalence. They thought we had received the same designation. I sat with that finding for 6 days before I transmitted it to the Naval Board. 6 days is not standard Naval Survey protocol for forwarding archive findings. I knew this. I made the decision deliberately. I needed to think about what I was transmitting and why, and I needed to do that thinking without the pressure of a transmission that had not yet been sent. I thought about what restricted origin meant for the 2 surviving civilizations, both thriving, both sealed from Solvani contact for centuries, both apparently uninterrupted in their own developmental trajectories, at least as documented in third-party records. The sealing had not diminished them. The absence of Solvani contact had not reduced them to anything less than what they had been before the designation was filed. They were simply outside the Solvani system, in a specific and defined way that neither party had explicitly agreed to, and neither party appeared to have subsequently disputed. And I thought about Commander Sest's question. What do we look like to them right now? I thought about those 60 minutes from the perspective of something on the other side of the assessment. A system 11,000 years old and 47 hulls strong, with 48 prior data points for comparison, and a precision of 30 meters across the full formation for the full assessment period. What had it received from the Ardent Theorem? It had received our mandate codes, our diplomatic registry, our standing order authorization, and a series of plain language hails in the first half of the assessment period. It had received accurate records of our course approach, our holding position, our weapons stand down, our navigation precision. It had received, through its instruments, 60 minutes of a single diplomatic survey cruiser sitting at the center of its formation, and doing exactly what a diplomatic survey cruiser is designed to do. It had not received a defensive posture. It had not received a weapons activation. It had not received a retreat or an escalation of hail frequency or any of the behavioral signals that might indicate we were close to doing something other than waiting. It had received 112 people doing their jobs. I thought about what 48 prior assessments might have produced. I do not have that data. But I know something about what fear looks like when it is given expression, and I know that the range of available responses to a situation like the one we were in includes many options that would have given the Solvani system something different to measure. We did not take any of those options. Not because we were not afraid. I have said I was afraid, and I believe my crew was afraid in some measure. And I hold that as a fact about the situation and not as a diminishment of what they did, but because we were there to do a job and the job was not to react. The job was to hold, to transmit, to record, and to wait, and that is what we did, and we did it for 60 minutes without deviation. My hypothesis, and I will call it a hypothesis, because that is what it is this: that the Solvani system was designed to read responses, and that it was very good at reading responses, because it had 48 prior data points and 11,000 years of refinement and capabilities that exceeded ours by significant margins in every measurable dimension. I believe it encountered 48 civilizations and received from each of them something it could process: a threat response, or a submission response, or an attempt to communicate, or a retreat, or a defensive posture, or a confusion that eventually resolved into one of those. I believe each of those responses told it something that fit within its 7-category framework. I believe it encountered the Ardent Theorem and received, for 60 minutes, a professional absence of response. Not the absence of capability, not the absence of awareness, not the absence of fear, but the disciplined, deliberate, professionally executed choice not to respond until there was something worth responding to. And I believe the Solvani system had not encountered that before, or had not encountered it in a form sufficiently consistent with prior examples to generate a confident category designation. I want to be precise about what I mean by this, because it is the heart of what I am trying to say, and I do not want it to be misunderstood. I am not suggesting that the Ardent Theorem impressed the Solvani system by being powerful. We were not powerful relative to what was around us. A single Crest-class diplomatic survey cruiser is not impressive in any absolute sense to a civilization that deploys 47 hulls in a perfect geometric shell from a cold null-space emergence and holds them to 30-meter positional deviation for 60 minutes. We were not impressive in the way that a large weapon is impressive. We were not threatening. We were not capable of intimidating an 11,000-year-old civilization with 47 times our hull strength in attendance. What I am suggesting is that the Solvani system was measuring something specific, and that what it measured in us was not what it had measured before. Not capability, not size or firepower or technological sophistication. Those things it could read from our hull geometry and our emissions profile. It did not need 60 minutes to read those things. What required 60 minutes, what the 60 minutes were designed to produce, was a behavioral record, a response record, an answer to the question of what kind of thing this new civilization was when presented with the geometric array and given an hour to demonstrate it. And the answer we gave was, this kind, the kind that sits down and does its job and waits. I do not know if that is the answer that triggered the restricted origin designation. I know it is the answer we gave. I know that 3 civilizations in 49 have received that designation, and that the departure broadcast we received structurally matches the departure broadcasts from 2 of those 3. I know that the Solvani system, which has had 11,000 years to refine its 7-category framework, and has applied it to 46 civilizations successfully, did not apply it to us. When a well-designed classification system encounters something it cannot classify, it has limited options. It can force the anomaly into the nearest available category, which requires accepting a known imprecision, and which a system 11,000 years old and that precise might be unwilling to do. It can reject the anomaly, which in a contact context means no designation at all, and there is no record in our database of the Solvani ever issuing no designation. Or it can file the anomaly under a holding designation that reserves the question for future assessment. I think restricted origin is a holding designation. I think it means we have encountered something our current framework cannot adequately classify, and we are not willing to misclassify it, and we are not going to discard it, and so we are setting it aside until our framework can accommodate it or until we have sufficient additional data to assign it correctly. I think it means come back after we have thought about this longer. I could be wrong. I have held this hypothesis for 6 years, and I hold it still, and I have not been able to find a better explanation, and I have looked for one with the same patience I am capable of applying to anything. Cavel's team is close to reading the designation. I expect to know within 2 years whether I was right. What I am certain of, what I will state as a finding and not a hypothesis, is this. The Ardent Theorem went to the Solvani Threshold on a routine survey approach. We followed our mandate and transmitted our codes and hailed on the required schedule and held our position when the geometric array assembled around us. We were afraid, in the way competent professionals are afraid, fully, quietly, without letting it interrupt the work. We were 112 people on a single diplomatic survey cruiser in the center of a 47-vessel formation, belonging to a civilization that had been assessing others for 11,000 years. And for 60 minutes, we did not give them anything except the most accurate possible picture of what we were. A civilization that had assessed 48 civilizations before us spent 60 minutes measuring that picture, and filed something when it was done, and left in silence. The silence has held for 6 years. I have not rushed it. I have not recommended a second approach, and I do not intend to recommend one until Cable can read what was filed, or until Sorvith's team produces additional evidence that changes my understanding of what was filed and why. Some things are worth waiting for, and the waiting, done correctly and with full attention, is itself a kind of answer to the question that is still being asked. I intend to be on the bridge when the Solvani system finishes asking it. That is my testimony. That is the complete account. This record is sealed. Dated this day, the 14th of March, year 13 of the Outer Survey Mandate, 6 years and 0 days from the event at the Solvani Threshold. Captain Lena Verk, UNES Ret. Commanding Officer UNES Ardent Theorem DSC 1147, Year 7 through Year 11 of the Outer Survey Mandate.